Wisdom of Solomon. The Wisdom of Solomon is one of those writings that didn't end up in every version of the Bible, but it still carries a bunch of influence because of the ideas it shares. At its heart, it celebrates wisdom, treating it as something far more powerful than advice. It's seen as a divine gift. What makes it unique is how it blends Jewish thought with Greek philosophy, creating a text that links spiritual devotion with intellectual reasoning. Scholars usually agree it was written in Greek by a Jewish author in Alexandria, sometime in the 1st century BC, although a few suggest it could have been earlier or even during the Roman period. Even though it wasn't part of the Hebrew Bible, it had a strong presence in the Septuagint and Old Latin translations, and it influenced some New Testament writings as well. The book presents wisdom in two ways. On one side, it's described as something God gives the righteous, shaping their understanding and their lives. On the other, it's eternal, always existing alongside God, almost like a bridge between humanity and the divine. Because of this dual view, the text stands with other biblical wisdom books like Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Sirach. Catholic and Orthodox traditions include it as scripture, but most Protestants keep it in the Apocrypha. It's also structured carefully, with 19 chapters divided into 3 sections. The first deals with eschatology and justice, contrasting the lives of the wicked and the righteous. The second presents Solomon's reflections on wisdom, prayer, and power. The third looks back at history, touching on plagues, false worship, and God's mercy, and ends with a doxology. Its message is directed at rulers, urging them to embrace righteousness and wisdom instead of living only for selfish pleasure. But Solomon's story has another side that isn't often talked about. Some writings outside the Bible portray him as more than just a wise king. They show him as someone who commanded spirits and even demons. The Testament of Solomon, for instance, tells how he used these powers to build his great temple. These accounts were considered too controversial, so they were left out of the Bible. Instead, the biblical version of Solomon highlights only his accomplishments as a king, leaving the darker parts out. This contrast makes the wisdom of Solomon even more fascinating because it sits between the image of Solomon as a divinely gifted ruler and the rumors of his dealings with spiritual powers. The Book of Adam and Eve. The Book of Adam and Eve, also known as the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, tells the story of what happened to the first humans after they were cast out of the Garden of Eden. It belongs to the pseudepigrapha, which means it's not accepted as scripture, but still carries ancient traditions. Most scholars believe it was written in Arabic by an Egyptian author and later translated into Ethiopic, with its origins dating a few centuries before the time of Christ. The first English translation only appeared in the 19th century. The text is divided into 2 books. The first follows Adam and Eve as they struggle after leaving Eden, with Satan tempting them repeatedly. It also gives a different spin on the story of Cain and Abel. According to this account, Cain had a twin sister named Luluwa, and he fell in love with her. His parents, however, wanted him to marry Abel's twin, Aklia, and this conflict is presented as the real reason Cain killed Abel. The second book covers the generations after Adam, focusing on the families of Seth and Cain. It mixes history with fantastical elements, like the claim that the earth rejected Abel's body and that Adam and Eve kept his remains in their cave for 7 years. The text also includes some contradictions with the biblical account. For example, it says both Cain and Abel brought blood sacrifices, which differs from Genesis. Because of these unusual details and imaginative storytelling, the Book of Adam and Eve has often been treated as a legendary or symbolic text rather than historical scripture. Still, it offers insight into how early communities wrestled with the story of humanity's beginnings. The Testaments. The Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs is another work from the pseudepigrapha, presented as the final words of Jacob's 12 sons. While the text claims to be their direct testimony, scholars believe it was written much later during the intertestamental period and eventually edited by early Christians. Each patriarch shares personal reflections, often confessing sins and urging their descendants to live moral lives. For example, Reuben warns against lust, Simeon repents for his jealousy, and Levi speaks about pride. Judah, Dan, and Gad caution against anger, hatred, and drunkenness, while Issachar and Zebulun emphasize simplicity and generosity. Joseph and Benjamin focus on purity, with Joseph being held up as an example because of his chastity and resistance to temptation. Even though the Testaments aren't part of the Bible, they give a glimpse into early Jewish and Christian ideas about ethics. They show how values like humility, charity, and purity were passed down in storytelling form, serving as moral lessons for future generations. Odes of Solomon. The Odes of Solomon is a collection of early Christian hymns that emerged in the late 1st century AD. They're not related to the Psalms of Solomon, which were written around 60 BC, but they serve a similar purpose by blending poetry with spiritual devotion. While they aren't considered scripture, they were likely used in worship to help believers memorize teachings and express their faith. The hymns highlight central Christian beliefs, especially the Trinity. They mention the Father, Son, and Spirit, showing that early Christians were already thinking about God in this threefold way. Some scholars have debated whether the text shows Gnostic influences, but overall it doesn't promote heresy. Instead, it reflects the kind of faith and devotion shaping the first generations of Christians. The odes also connect with early figures like Ignatius of Antioch, suggesting they were written in the same cultural and theological atmosphere. What makes them stand out is how they use poetry to capture deep truths, making them both a devotional tool and a window into early Christian worship practices. The story of Achar. The story of Achar is an ancient Near Eastern tale from around the 5th or 6th century BC. It tells the dramatic story of Achar, a wise and loyal counselor to Assyrian kings Sennacherib and Esarhaddon. Even though he served faithfully, Achar was betrayed by his adopted nephew, Nadin, who falsely accused him of treason. Sentenced to death, Achar was spared by the executioner, who valued their friendship and instead hid in secret until Nadin's schemes came to light. This tale isn't considered scripture, but it's filled with proverbs and moral lessons that highlight wisdom, justice, and loyalty. Its influence spread far beyond Assyria, showing up in Jewish literature like the Book of Tobit and even inspiring Christian and Islamic traditions later on. Because it focuses so heavily on the value of integrity and wise counsel, it continued to resonate with different cultures long after it was first told. The books of 1st and 2nd Ezra. The books of 1st and 2nd Ezra, sometimes called Esdras, occupy an unusual spot in biblical literature. They aren't included in most modern biblical canons, but they appear in some Greek Orthodox, Episcopal, or Lutheran traditions. 1st Esdras belongs to the apocryphal or deuterocanonical texts, while 2nd Esdras is usually considered pseudepigraphal and apocalyptic. 1st Esdras recounts events like King Josiah's reforms and the Jews returning from Babylon, although it contains noticeable historical mistakes. 2nd Esdras, written later, addresses Jewish suffering and delivers 7 visions attributed to Ezra, including messianic prophecies. Even though these works raise questions about authorship and accuracy, they give valuable insight into Jewish thought in the years after the exile. They capture how communities tried to make sense of history and suffering through visions, prophecy, and reflection. The books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. The books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees are central to Jewish history, even though not all traditions recognize them as scripture. They chronicle the Jewish revolt against the Seleucid Empire between 175 and 134 BC. These books are part of the canon in Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Coptic, and Russian Orthodox traditions, but they are not accepted by Protestants or Jews. 1st Maccabees focuses on the struggle for religious freedom after King Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, desecrated the temple and tried to suppress Jewish practices. It tells the story of the Maccabean family, starting with Mattathias and continuing with his son Judas, who led a successful revolt and restored Jewish traditions. 2nd Maccabees, written in Greek, adds a more theological layer, introducing beliefs like prayers for the dead and resurrection. Beyond their historical value, these books influenced Catholic teachings and inspired Hanukkah, making them significant both religiously and culturally. The Book of Jubilees, written sometime between 135 and 105 BC, retells biblical history from creation to the time of Moses. The story is presented as being revealed by an angel, which gives it an otherworldly authority. One of its standout features is its emphasis on a strict 364-day solar calendar and rigorous observance of religious practices like Sabbath keeping and circumcision. Unlike the Bible's more nuanced portrayals of the patriarchs, Jubilees glorifies them, often presenting them as flawless role models. Scholars think it may have been written by someone connected to the Essenes, since it shares similarities with teachings found at Qumran. Because of its strict laws and sometimes extreme punishments, it was not accepted into most religious canons. Still, it provides a fascinating window into the diversity of Jewish thought in that era, especially about law, time, and tradition. The Gospel of Mary. The Gospel of Mary is one of the more intriguing discoveries from early Christian history. Found in 1896, it dates back to the 3rd or 5th centuries AD and was written in both Greek and Coptic. While it is often associated with Mary Magdalene, the text never actually clarifies which Mary is being referred to. Unfortunately, large sections of the manuscript are missing, which makes interpreting its full message difficult. Many scholars see it as a Gnostic text from the late 2nd century, designed to promote teachings outside mainstream Christianity under the authority of a well-known biblical figure. Its value doesn't lie in historical accuracy, but in what it reveals about early debates and heresies. It shows how some Christian groups used alternative writings to challenge or reinterpret established teachings. Even though it was never part of the official canon, it gives modern readers insight into the diversity of thought and the conflicts within early Christianity. These are books that were banned for many different reasons, but what do you think of them? Share your thoughts in the comments.